Hi, hope you like and follow so you can get notified of new episodes. And now it's time to
Tell me an old captain story.
Episode 15 Old Captain and the Legends of the Blue Bear, Part 1. One day, Old Captain, Simon, and Miles were out on a hiking quest to discover the legend of a place called Blue Bear Mountain. The three were walking along the base of the mountain, just entering the forest of pine trees as the morning dew started to evaporate. "Why do they call it Blue Bear Mountain?" Simon asked. "Well," Old Captain began, "according to the legend, it's because the mountain isn't actually a mountain, but a bear." "What?" Miles said incredulously. "How's that possible?" "It's not," said Simon. "It's just a story." "Imagine how ginormous that would be," Miles said with a laugh. "It would indeed be ginormous," Old Captain agreed, "but I'm sure that's not the case, although legends are often rooted in some level of truth. "So you're saying that the bear could be as big as a mountain?" Simon asked. "No, no," Old Captain shook his head. "I'm saying that the bear might have been unusually large, but not gigantic like that. People tend to embellish things, especially things related to nature, and even more when those things from nature are dangerous." "But why is that?" Miles said. "Why do people do that?" "Good question," Old Captain said with a shrug. "I guess I really don't know why. I think it's because humans sometimes feel small in this world, with all the big creatures and scary weather, and when people survive scary things, they might add details that may or may not be accurate to make themselves feel better." "Just imagine if it was really that big," Miles said. "That would be terrifying," Old Captain replied. "Terrifying, but also super cool," Simon offered. Old Captain nodded with a conciliatory shrug. "Yeah, cool from a safe distance." The happy trio walked on until almost noon when they decided to stop for water and a break. They came to a gentle stream with a few flat, mossy rocks and decided to dip their feet in the cool water and have an early lunch. Old Captain unslung his bag of grabbing, the magical satchel that could provide just about anything he wished. "What do we want to have for lunch today, boys?" he said cheerfully. "Pizza!" they both said at once. Old Captain smiled as he felt around the inside of the bag as if he couldn't find something. "Hmm, I guess I'm all out of broccoli." "No, not broccoli. Pizza," Miles said. "Brussels sprouts?" Old Captain said as if he were hard of hearing. "No, pizza," both boys said again, although Old Captain could tell Simon was playing along. "I don't see any turnips. You'll just have to eat this. Here." "Aw, man." Miles started to look legitimately frustrated when he saw what the old cavalier produced from the bag. Old Captain handed a steaming hot slice of cheese pizza for Miles and one pepperoni slice for Simon. He got out his own slice of extra pepperoni with some jalapenos. Once everyone had their slices of pizza, he brought out some waters and a plate of cucumber and apple slices. Looking at the mountain, Old Captain noticed that there appeared to be a sort of saddle between two summits. "So," Miles started, "how could a bear be as big as a mountain? If it were real, I mean." "It couldn't," Simon said dismissively as he put a slice of apple and cucumber together in his mouth. "And why is it blue?" Miles finished. "Well," Old Captain took a swig of water, "the legend is actually quite interesting." He wiped his mouth with his sleeve. "As I recall, the story goes something like this." "Wait," Simon put a finger up. "Is this going to be one of your long stories?" Old Captain blinked. "The reason I ask is, shouldn't we start hiking again first? Otherwise, we'll get too into the story, and it'll be too late to hike if we stay here." Old Captain nodded. "That's actually a really good point, Simon. We should get going, and I'll tell you the story on the way. How's that?" "Sounds good," Miles said. Simon nodded in agreement. The boys and Old Captain packed up their lunch remains and got back to the business of hiking the trail. The way got a little rockier as they climbed. Fewer roots were exposed on the trail, more stones were. Pine needles on the forest floor started to thin out as they got closer to the tree line. So, the legend says that in the very first days of the world, there was no sky, Old Captain began. What? Both boys questioned. Well, I guess the sky was not like what we see today. Old Captain gestured toward a clear cobalt blue sky with a few puffy white clouds in the distance. What was it like? Miles asked. I guess it would have been a very dark color, Old Captain said, like a rusty brown or charcoal gray. I don't know, but it wasn't blue. In fact, there was no color at all. Even water was grayish colored, until one day someone came along known as the artist and started to paint things. Really? Miles said with his 6-year-old charm. Simon scoffed, but Old Captain ignored it. That's what they say, he replied. Anyway, the artist was a giant, and he had a faithful friend with him in the form of a giant grizzly bear named Tontan. Tontan was the first bear ever, and she was bigger than anything. Tontan dug up all the valleys with her great paws, and in doing so, she created the mountains from the soil she dug up. So the artist decided that the sky should be blue. He took out a great wide brush and dipped it into some paint, and with big strokes, he painted the sky with every color blue you could imagine. But then the sky started to sag like a wet canvas, and he worried that it would fall on the earth and ruin the painting. So the giant asked his friend Tontan if she would stand underneath the sky and hold it up until it dried. She did, and that's how her fur turned blue. What about the giant? Simon asked. The artist had to go off to paint other parts of the world, like the ocean and the forests and the deserts, Old Captain said. Tontan the bear waited for him to return. The bear and the artist were the best of friends, so she waited and waited. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into years, but still the artist did not come. And yet Tontan stayed there and held up the sky like she was asked. What happened? Asked Miles. Even Simon leaned in to hear the story. Nobody knows, the captain said. The artist never returned. Did something happen to the giant? The artist? Simon said. Did he die? Miles asked. Old Captain smiled at the question from Miles. It had been one he asked frequently from about the time he was 4. Almost any story told within earshot of the young wizard would be interrupted with the question, did he die? Or did she die? The teller of that story, whatever that story was, whether it was something that happened at school or work or in the world, would have to answer it, or else Miles would ask it again and again until it was resolved. Nobody knows, Old Captain said, answering the current question. Maybe he's still out there. He looked to each boy. Maybe he's painting new parts of the world. Who knows? That's a sad story, Simon said. So Tauntaun waited for him to come back, but he never did? So she was forced to hold up the sky forever? Maybe she's still holding it up, Old Captain shrugged. But maybe she died, Miles offered. Yeah, could be, Old Captain acknowledged. Maybe the mountain is her final resting place. Stop talking about death so much, Simon said. The young knight was never comfortable when the subject of death came up. The trio finished their lunch and got back to hiking. They made their way through the last of the thickest parts of the forest, where the floor was soft with mossy rocks and pine needles. Then they started to feel the sun on their faces as the tree line thinned out, and they walked past a spot where there had been a rock slide at some time. Old Captain noticed that, as they made their way up the trail, Simon and Miles seemed to be looking at the mountain a little differently. Everything all right, guys? Old Captain asked. He received a few barely audible grunts in the affirmative, so he let it be and kept on walking. It wasn't until a few minutes later that Miles spoke up. How come the mountain isn't blue? The wizard asked. I was thinking that too, Simon said. Old Captain thought about it for a moment. Well, the legend says that Tauntaun was the very first bear, right? Yeah, both boys agreed simultaneously. So, think about that. That would have been thousands of years ago then. The mountain may have just grown around her, and she sort of became the mountain. They walked for a time in silence, when Simon suddenly stopped in his tracks. Wait a minute, the young knight said. Miles and Old Captain stopped and turned to look at the knight. What? Old Captain asked. What if she's not dead? Who? Tauntaun. Simon's eyes were alight. Don't you see? She's a bear. She's hibernating. Oh, yeah, good point, Simon. Old Captain smiled. You might be right. But how long would she even hibernate for? Miles asked. Who knows? Old Captain answered. I think regular sized grizzly bears hibernate for around 6 months at a time, if I'm not mistaken. But Tauntaun isn't a regular size, so she probably hibernates for years and years, said Simon. As the day wore on, a group of gray clouds huddled near the top of the mountain. Simon, Miles, and Old Captain were each minding their steps on the trail and seemingly lost in their own thoughts. Old Captain stopped for a moment and took off his hat to brush his brow. He looked up and saw a bighorn sheep high up near a slot between two boulders. He called out to the boys to look, but the ram skittered up the rocky incline before he could see it. Disappointed, Old Captain put his hat back on and then felt something on the back of his hand. It was a raindrop, and it brought some of its friends. Within seconds, there was a downpour. Old Captain and the boys hurried along the trail looking for any shelter they could find when Miles called out. Over there! The little wizard pointed at an overhanging rock about 50 yards up and to the right of the trail. They scrambled quickly as they could, navigating the rocks and debris from past rock slides. They got to the overhang to discover a cave hiding behind a boulder, and they were equally relieved and reluctant to go in. Miles, Simon said, how about some light? The young wizard put his staff in the crook of his underarm and cupped his hands together and blew in them. A warm orange glow lit between his fingers as a flame came to life in his hands. Old Captain? Said Miles. Yes. Could you please grab the bottle of bubbles from my pocket? Sure. Old Captain glanced at Simon, who just shrugged. He did as instructed and pulled from the wizard's outside pocket of his robe a simple plastic bottle that had a faded sticker depicting bubbles floating in the air. Now, Miles said as he was concentrating on the flame in his hands, take out the wand and blow a bubble over my hands. Okay. Old Captain smiled with amusement mixed with wonder. This'll be interesting. The old cavalier took out the bubble wand, and with careful, slow breath, he blew a bubble big enough to fit Miles' hands in. The bubble, to Old Captain and Simon's surprise, did not pop, but wrapped around the flames as if it were made of glass. Miles took his hands away then, and there in front of them floated an orb of fire, providing light. Miles smiled, happy with his spell, and gently blew the bubble-encased flame, which responded by floating just a few feet in front of him and over his head as he led the way into the dark cave. Wow, Simon and Old Captain said in unison. I'm impressed, Miles, Simon said, and patted his brother on the shoulder. Thanks. Miles smiled and blushed a little, for a compliment from one's older brother is worth 10 from just about anyone else. The bubble of fire made quite a bit of light, as the bubble, which was still only a bubble, reflected the light like a highly polished glass. Exploring the cave did not take long, and they were pleased to find it uninhabited. There was an odd root that crept down the inside of the cave opening with a bluish flower blossom struggling toward the light. They set up a small fire with some kindling they found outside, and set about enjoying a snack with mugs of hot cocoa Old Captain pulled out of the bag of grabbing and waited out the rain. Do bears dream? Miles asked. Probably, Simon answered. I think just about everything that sleeps dreams, Old Captain said. Dogs dream. You've seen Frito move his legs in his sleep, right? He's dreaming when he does that. Miles looked thoughtful. Simon popped a marshmallow in his mouth from the top of his hot cocoa. I wonder what the blue bear dreams about, said Miles as he scratched his hairless chin. Maybe she dreams about blue honey, Simon said. They all laughed at that. You would need blue bees for that. Ha ha, Miles said. Actually, Old Captain said, there's a legend about that too. About what? The boys both asked. About the blue bear's dreams. Old Captain took a sip of cocoa and wiped the foam from his mustache. Apparently, if the blue bear deems you worthy, she will let you into her dreams and even test you. Test you? How? Asked Miles. She tests your soul and whatever it is you need to work on. Both boys gave Old Captain a blank look and blinked. Sounds boring, said Simon. Sure does, Miles agreed. Maybe so, Old Captain said. But if I recall, the legend also says that Tontan gives those who are worthy a choice of what gift she bestows on them, and in that is their trial. What do you mean? Miles cocked his head to the side. So, the three choices, according to the legend, are strength, wisdom, and healing. But you can only choose one. What would you choose? Strength, said Simon without hesitation. That way I could be super strong. Wisdom, said Miles. He smiled as he put his hands together and rubbed them like a mad genius. That way I could learn all the best spells. Well, you are a wizard, Old Captain nodded to Miles, and you're a knight, he gestured to Simon. I guess I'd have to take healing then. Old Captain chuckled to himself and shrugged. It was moments like this that reminded him that they were still boys. Simon would be 10 in the fall, and Miles had just turned 6. They each enjoyed their mug of hot cocoa and some warm cookies that Old Captain brought out of the magic satchel. The rain had not let up yet, but intensified a bit, and they wondered how long they would be there in the cave. A gust of wind blew into the cave, then, bringing a spray of rain and a distinct sweet flowery smell. Well, it looks like we're here for a while, boys, Old Captain said with a yawn. He looked over at Simon and Miles then, both of whom were yawning and struggling to keep their eyes open. Miles's bubble firelight was still hovering over them, providing a warm glow. Old Captain wondered if the hot cocoa was a bad idea, as they all seemed ready to fall asleep now. He felt the need for sleep pulling him down, as if gravity had nearly doubled, but he could not sleep without making sure they'd be safe. Fighting to keep his eyes open, he reached into one of his many pockets in his frock coat and pulled out a pair of shiny little dog figurines made of pewter. They were not unlike the dog piece in the board game Monopoly. He set them both down gently on a rock closest to the cave opening. Oliver and Petunia, he said affectionately with a little smile, keep us safe. The figurines were, of course, magical. Old Captain used them sometimes when he needed to sleep and could not set a watch over the camp. As such, if anyone or anything decided to approach the cave, or even come within eyesight of the opening, the two figurines would turn into live versions of Old Captain's dogs that were now long gone. He'd gotten the figurines in a bazaar in Calcutta from a kindly old witch. She needed something from each dog, so he'd reached into his pocket and gave her 2 little plastic bags. They each contained a lock of fur from Oliver, a Yorkie Poo, and Petunia, a Maltese, that he'd cut from their coats on the day they died. He had carried them with him in his breast pocket as something to remember them by and to keep them close. With the fur, the witch cast a spell on each figurine so they would come to life to alert Old Captain of danger with their small dog barks as they had done in life so long before. This way, Old Captain would be most horribly torn from slumber by the loudest, piercing barks a small dog could muster. They were not attack dogs, they were attack yap dogs. Old Captain sat back down, with an alarm system of sorts in place. He could no longer resist the unusually strong urge to sleep. Simon rolled over when something nudged him, and his nose was immediately bit by cold. He opened his eyes to see nothing but white. It snowed? He scrambled up to find he was alone in the cave, and that the fire was out, and somehow snow blew inside from the cave opening. What the heck? Simon said aloud. His words were met with silence. There was only the faint sound of wind outside the cave. Looking out, the world was just like a blank piece of paper, all white. Where is everyone? He wondered. He looked around the cave. He didn't see any sign of them. The snow that had blown into the cave had no tracks, nothing to suggest old Captain or Miles had walked out of the cave. He walked to the entrance and looked out onto the world. Everywhere he looked was new fallen, undisturbed snow. The world outside was quiet. Simon looked around and came to the sudden and horrible realization that he was totally alone.
See you next time on
Tell me an old captain story.